the chance for a durable Washington-Moscow strategic partnership was lost in the 1990s after the Soviet Union ended. Actually, it was lost earlier because it was Reagan and Gorbachev who gave us the opportunity. But it certainly ended in the Clinton administration. And it didn't end in Moscow, it ended in Washington. It was squandered and lost in Washington. And it was lost so badly that today, for at least 2 years, and I would argue since the Georgian War of 2008, we have been in literally a new Cold War with Russia. Now, people don't want to call it that who made American policy during the last 20 years, because if they said, yes, we're in a new Cold War, they have to explain what they were doing during this time. So they say, oh, it's not a Cold War. Okay. It's a really horrible situation and exceedingly dangerous. And here's my next point. This new Cold War has all the potential to be even more dangerous than the preceding 40-year Cold War for several reasons. First of all, think about it. Those of us in this room of that generation, and we seem to be in the majority, know that the epicenter of that Cold War was in Berlin, not close to Russia. And there was an enormous buffer zone between Russia and the West in these satellite or bloc countries in Eastern Europe. Today, the epicenter is literally on Russia's borders in Ukraine. It's Ukraine that set this off. And Ukraine remains the ticking time bomb politically. And this is not only on Russia's borders, this is through the heart of Russia's and Ukrainians' Slavic civilization. This is a civil war even more profound in its ethos than was the American Civil War. These are people who were raised in the same faith, speak the same language, are intermarried. Any of you know how many intermarried Russian and Ukrainians there are today? The reality is the Clinton administration adopted unwise policies, winner take all. And what were the consequences of these policies? Well, they were a lot. They blew the chance for a strategic partnership, but the four policies that most offended Russia and offend them today were the following. Obviously, the decision to expand NATO right to Russia's borders. I mean, it's a joke. We say Putin has violated the post-Cold War order of Europe. Russia was excluded from the post-World War, post-Cold War order of Europe by NATO expansion. Russia was pushed somewhere out there. And Russia kept saying, hey, let's do a pan-European security arrangement, like Gorbachev and Reagan said. And we said, this is not military. This is about democracy and free trade. It's going to be great for you. Swallow your poison with a smile. And while they had no choice, they did. And then when they had a choice, not. They start pushing back, as any leader of Russia would who was sober and had support in his own country. I don't say that as a joke. He was by the end, look at the pictures. Yeltsin could barely walk. He was pushed out. He didn't resign voluntarily. But the point of it is anybody could have predicted this back in the 1990s, and some of us did. Secondly, there's the absolute refusal on the part of the United States to negotiate on missile defense. Missile defense is now a NATO project. That means missile defense, building installations, whether it's on land or sea is more dangerous, whether land or sea, is now part of NATO expansion and encirclement of Russia. It's part of the same system. Russians are absolutely convinced it's targeted at their nuclear retaliatory capability. We say, oh no, it's about Iran, it's not about you. But go talk to Ted Postal at MIT. Stage 4 missile defense is an offensive weapon. It also violates the INF agreement because it can fire cruise missiles, while we're blaming the Russians for developing cruise missiles again, as they are. Because we're back in this tit-for-tat, mutual buildup arms race. Thirdly, this meddling in Russia's internal affairs in the name of democracy promotion. We've been doing this since the 90s. Are you aware that when Medvedev was president of Russia and Mrs. Clinton and Michael McFaul had their wondrous reset, which was a rigged roulette game, if you look at the terms of it, that Vice President Biden went to Moscow University and said Putin should not return to the presidency, and then said that directly to Putin's face? So Putin comes over here next week and tells Rubio he thinks he ought to drop out. And we say, well, okay. I mean, are there any red lines left anymore when it comes to Russia? Do we have the right to be telling them? I mean, it extends to every issue, but it certainly extends to politics. And the White House simply can't keep its mouth shut. And it's egged on by vested lobbies. We all believe in democracy, but you're not going to impose democracy on Russia. And if it is, you won't like the democracy you get there. So, ask yourself two questions. Is there a Russian side of this story that needs to be considered, in the aftermath of Paris at least? And does Russia have any legitimate national interests at all in the world? And if so, what are they? On their borders? Because until Paris happened, I wasn't sure there was any hope at all. There's still a chance to achieve this lost partnership with Russia, at least in three realms. First of all, Ukraine. You all know what the Minsk Accords are. They were drafted by Merkel and by Hollande. They were signed by Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, and by Putin, and they call for a negotiated end to the civil war in Ukraine. They recognize that it is primarily a civil war, not primarily, though secondarily, Russian aggression. But the civil war has to be ended, and it's steps. Here's what you got to do. And I don't care what the American media tells you. It's Kiev that has refused to follow through on its obligations. But this is a possibility. And to end that civil war or mute it down would be exceedingly security building today. They're bumper stickers, but the unipolar, monopolar world is over. There's a multipolar world emerging before our eyes, not just Russia, but in 5 or 6 capitals. And Washington's stubborn resistance to embrace this has become part of the problem, not the solution. And that's where we are today, after Paris.
Our thanks to Professor Stephen Cohen, Emeritus Professor at New York University and Princeton University.
I mean, the truth is that the person who's made the best statements, and they're not sophisticated, has been Donald Trump. And the reason is what he said, because in his mind there's a business model for everything, is I'll get along with Putin because I'll make a deal. Well, I say, okay, a deal making is called diplomacy. It would be good to hear from him what diplomacy he has in mind. But he and Rand Paul have been the only two who have said that this aggressive American military posture and sanctions toward Russia were not a good idea, and that was before Paris. So it would, and the Democratic debate was a bust in my mind. A couple of days after, has broken American promises to Russia over the last 20 years. And everybody says, oh, you mean Bush's promise to Gorbachev that NATO would not expand if Gorbachev would agree to a reunited Germany and NATO. It began there. But look what happened after 9/11. Putin put himself way out of his ballpark with his own people when he told George Bush, whatever you want, we'll give you. And do you know what he gave us? He gave us American lives. Not only did he give us Russian information and right to travel and supply Afghanistan over Russia, but there was a fighting force left over from the Soviet adventure in Afghanistan called the Northern Alliance, what the Russians had continued to train, Russian officers, in Afghanistan. He gave that to Bush to do the early fighting. And so for every Northern Alliance soldier who died fighting the Taliban to drive him out of Kabul, it would have been an American soldier. What did he get? What did Putin get in return? Quickly, Bush withdrew from the anti-ballistic missile treaty unilaterally. That was the bedrock of Soviet nuclear security, and we started this missile defense again. And Bush undertook a second round of NATO expansion to Russia's borders. So how does Putin explain how smart he is to his own people? You give and they take. And if you really wanted to go into it, you could look at the reset, because it was that all over again. Russia gave everything we asked for. We gave nothing in return. So there's this anger that you can't trust the Americans.
Let's turn to Ukraine, an equally thorny question. Why do you think the U.S. tilts towards Ukraine, which I assume you do, and why? Why do you think we tilt towards Ukraine? Is it that same Thomas Jefferson syndrome, promotion of democracy? This is the little guy the hope for democracy that started with the fall of the Soviet Union? Why have we supported Ukraine to this degree?
There is no the Ukraine in the sense of a civilization or a country. There was a post-Soviet Ukrainian state, and it was a mess. And even Ukrainians themselves agreed. It was corrupt, it was divided. But historically, and this is not Putin's fault. If you want to blame somebody, blame God, if you're of such a frame of mind, or history, to be more agnostic about it. History created, on the territories upon which sat the post-Soviet Ukrainian state, a very divided country, politically, religiously, ethnically, linguistically, culturally. A large part of the country, primarily in central Ukraine and western Ukraine, wanted to become part of Europe. And a large part of the country, primarily in eastern and southern Ukraine, did not want to give up its ancient century-old attachment to Russian civilization, the Russian church, or to its Russian in-laws. Though, of course, if you want to get rid of your in-laws, it would be a good idea to join Europe because they're not going to get visas, and you'll say, sorry, can't have you for Christmas this year. But this was a profound... Gorbachev has made the point that his wife, Raisa, his beloved wife, was Ukrainian, and all his in-laws were Ukrainian. And my wife, Katrina, and I have met more Russians than not who have Ukrainian family, extended family. So you begin with the fact that this was a divided country. And if there was ever a country that needed some kind of federation to stay together, keep people happy, to mediate differences, decentralization, it was Ukraine. We have a federation. Canada has a federation. Germany has a federation. Lots of countries have federations, are federated governments. But in Ukraine, when the crisis began, the president of Ukraine appointed the governors of all the regions, and sometimes even the mayors. Kiev decided, and this was an underlying issue, even the most prosperous parts of Ukraine economically, which was eastern Ukraine, because it was the industrial heartland of Ukraine with the real trade, which was with Russia, paid way too much taxes and got too little back from Kiev. So there was this underlying tax issue. We fought a civil war, which was about slavery, but these other issues were embedded in the slave issue. But we fought a civil war. There was no need for Ukraine to fight a civil war over this. So I don't tilt toward Ukraine. I'm aware that there's a Ukrainian civil war, and civil wars are the most horrible of wars. And in the modern day, they lead to a proxy war. Yeah, Putin could not let, after February, Donbass, which is the region in eastern Ukraine that's both most industrial and most Russian. But not only ethnically Russian, because there are a lot of ethnic Ukrainians for whom, Russian is their native language. They can't even speak Ukrainian. So you couldn't really, and Poroshenko, the president's Ukrainian, wasn't very good. What's the point here? More Russians, at least when this all began, the more Ukrainians, no matter where they lived, spoke Russian as their everyday language, fluently, grammatically, culturally, well, and watched more Russian TV and all the rest than they did Ukrainian. Now, the Ukrainian government's trying to stop that by unwise methods, forcibly. But you can't say you're for or against Ukraine, and that's, of course, the bunk that the State Department's been putting out. You've got to say this is a civil war. Now, you could say, Gloria, if you wanted to do something Americans shouldn't, which side we favor. But we shouldn't do that. And if people ask me, well, which side is worse? Kiev or the guys running the rebel operation in Donbass? I revert, when asked which is worse, to the Russian intelligentsia proverb, both are worst. Both are worst. So Minsk, and Merkel put a lot of political capital on this. Hollande at that time had no political capital. He was trying to get some political capital. On these Minsk Accords to resolve the civil war, because if the civil war stopped, the killing would stop. And then, as Churchill liked to say, jaw, 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 don't fight, fight, fight. But this required certain constitutional agreements that could only be passed by the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada in Kiev, which it has refused to pass. And mainly they involve something we all understand, more home rule for eastern Ukraine. But, and this is what's interesting, a constitutional amendment that devolves what we used to call it states' rights, and we're hearing about it from the Republicans now, budgetary, political, and the rest, to eastern Ukraine is not specific. It devolves these same rights to western Ukraine. And whether you like it or not, and whether this is the right word or not, there is a surging neo-fascist movement in Ukraine. They took 30% of the vote in Kiev last week. Klitschko won re-election, but he was forced into a runoff. 30% of the vote, because the candidate ran not on one of the neo-fascist parties, but on some surrogate party. He got 30% is a lot. When people tell me neo-fascists are marginal forces in Ukraine, that's 30% too much for this Jew. Way too much. I can live with 1%. If I know where they are. And they running strong in these traditional ultra-nationalist Western provinces of Ukraine. So if the Minsk Accords are fully implemented, and if the decentralized constitution is democratic, you're not going to get virtue everywhere. But at least it puts it to the Ukrainian people, to all of them. And one of the conditions, of course, is that there be a complete ceasefire and all foreign troops leave the country. And you say, oh, that's great, the Russians will have to go home. Well, so will the Americans. We are told officially we have 1,200 American soldiers, boots on the ground, in Ukraine, training Ukrainians under Kiev's control to fight. If you think it's 1,200, I will give you the George Washington Bridge for a dime. I mean, that's what we're told. But they're running a lot of special operations there. But if this happens, we have to go home too. And the Russians have to go home. But the trouble with sending the Russians home is that really, in some fundamental way, leaving military aside, they live there. Like their in-laws or not, they live there. And there's never been a time when there wasn't free passage back and forth from Russia to Ukraine. It's just a stake driven through the heart of a vast family. That from the beginning, as soon as NATO expansion began, which was, when did Clinton decide, 96, 97, that Ukraine was the brass ring. And you know, this big Brzezinski's famous statement that makes no geopolitical sense whatsoever, but it was clever, that without Ukraine, Russia's a normal state. With Ukraine, it's an empire. This became the kind of ideological justification that then we would have a tamed Russian bear who would do our biddings, but as long as they're allied with or control Ukraine, Russia will be an empire that threatens us. So they had a perspective. It was serious. I don't deride the intellectual thought that went into it. It was just profoundly wrong-headed. It was dangerous to American national security because it either didn't understand or didn't care about the way the world was changing. And I don't want to say they're responsible for Paris, but how many more Bostons and Paris and 9/11s? And by the way, just so you don't forget this, to be humane, Russia has still lost more souls to terrorism since the 1990s than any country on earth. They tend to lose them in batches of 200 and 300, 400s, in airplanes, pitch battles, that school in Beslan, that theater, what was it called, the Nort in Moscow. We lost 3,000 plus on 9/11. Paris lost, I think they're saying, 150 or so. Some in the hospital will die, unfortunately. So, but Russia, if you're counting victims of terrorism, gets to be number one. It's not the sporting event that it was competing in. But you got to be aware of the fact that in addition to being part of the solution, Russia has suffered probably more than anybody else from the problem. And that was what was lost, I think, in Washington in the 1990s, this sense of this is the real brass ring. That you all know what the Eastern Partnership was, right? The NATO Eastern Partnership? All right, you're not sure. In 2008, the Bush administration tried to fast-track Georgia and Ukraine into NATO, and it was vetoed by Germany and France. So, a guy in Poland who became foreign minister named Sikorsky dreamt up with Carl Bildt, the former foreign minister of a Scandinavian country, the so-called Eastern Partnership, that instead of bringing them into NATO, we would offer them these wonderful partnerships that would bring them into Europe as part of European free market, free visa travel, etc. Clearly, it was meant to be eventually a road to NATO membership. The Russians did not object to that. They just objected to the trade terms because they said, Ukraine, we are Ukraine's largest trading partner and vice versa. It's an enormous trading relationship built over centuries. If you are going to let Europe's goods flow through Ukraine without customs into our markets, our producers are going to be destroyed. This has to be negotiated. And the European Union absolutely refused to negotiate for 2 years with Russia on this. So Putin then said, okay, let's make this a tripartite arrangement. Let's do a trade partnership between Russia, Ukraine, Kiev, and the European Union. And he was told, take a walk. So now, go look at the partnership agreement that the elected president, he was a rotter, but he was elected, of Ukraine, refused to sign in November 2013, that set off the protest that led to the Maidan, that led to the fall of the government, led to the Civil War. It's 1,000 pages. I did not read 1,000 pages. But a person I knew said, read these 7 pages buried at the end. And in that agreement that Yanukovych was supposed to sign, that was allegedly only about economics, and by the way, it was the world's worst economic deal. I mean, it would have cost Ukraine, which was already impoverished, billions and billions of dollars, and given it nothing until it went through the austerity program that has brought Greece to its knees. But if the Ukrainian people want to do that, good luck. It hasn't worked anyplace, but if they want to do it. But buried in these 7 pages was a section called Military Security Issues. Military security issues. NATO was not mentioned, but it says in signing this agreement, Ukraine agrees to abide by the military security policies of the European Union. What are the military security policies of the European Union? NATO. Any lawyer would have picked that up quick. Russia has a lot of lawyers, good lawyers, and they were on this. That was never reported in the American press. But the fact is, had Yanukovych signed that, now he wouldn't have abided by it, but he was saying, if NATO decides X, we have to do it. And Russia knew about this. So it's this NATO issue that's created this problem, along with the divided Ukraine, that's different from the Baltics, profoundly different. Not to mention, you're talking about 400 million souls in Ukraine, and I don't know how many, less than in San Francisco, maybe in the Baltics. I don't know. It's not a populous area. By the way, if you give me one digression, because this is a big issue, and we need to talk to particularly our young people about this. It's gone down as like, the 111th Amendment to the United States Constitution, that every country has a right to join NATO. No, they do not. NATO is a security organization. It is not the American Association of Retired People. That's not what NATO's about. NATO either increases security or it doesn't. That's the only criterion. It's not Walmart. It's not a non-selective fraternity or sorority. It's a security organization. This bunk that the expansion of NATO has increased the security of Europe and all the new nations died in eastern Ukraine. 8,000 dead, 2 million displaced, and no end in sight. A ruined Ukraine. Ukraine is totally, economically, fiscally, financially, ruination. The IMF is going to violate its own rules. It doesn't give money to countries that have sovereign unpaid debt. It's going to violate their rule. They've got to save. They can't let Kiev default. They're going to violate the rules, but it's ruination. This is security. Are the Balts really more secure today? Is poor little Georgia, a lovely little country where we tried to pull them into NATO, more secure? I mean, it's brought nobody security. And one of the problems is that little countries with historical grievances against Russia, and who doesn't have a historical grievance against Russia? My grandfather didn't like the pogroms. Everybody's got a grievance against Russia. But you can't build your modern life or your modern security on ancient tombstones and going around kicking them over. That's what the Muslim world is doing. It's kicking over ancient tombstones and resentments and turning them into murderous movements. You can't do that. So NATO membership should never have been increased after the Russians abolished the Warsaw Pact. But certainly, if you really believe in NATO, you don't start taking in countries that are going to be ticking time bombs of insecurity. That's not security. That's something else. So this notion of a right to join NATO, which the NATO bureaucracy in Brussels has used to enrich itself at our expense, because the United States pays the defense budget of NATO, and the reasons countries there don't mind staying is they don't have to pay for their own defense. Good deal. But this has become dangerous now, this ideology that there's some God-given right to be a member of NATO. I think.
We are out of time, unfortunately, because this interesting discussion could go on for a long time. So let me thank, on behalf of the Commonwealth Club, our wonderful guest, Dr. Stephen Cohen, Professor Emeritus of Russian Studies and Politics at NYU and Princeton. Thank you to our audiences here on the radio and on the internet. Take a moment.